I had my tussles with the Xerox machine this morning. The main one is broken, the other one jammed, and after being jammed, it's producing pages with smeared ink, so we'll see how jammed fares. I have also Bruce, and I got the other thing copied. This is the one that wouldn't copy. Now, Bruce passed this out earlier, and I've got copies that we can make copies of this afterwards if you don't have this thing. This is an article by Peter Steinfeld from the October 24th, 2009 New York Times, which Bruce has referred to several times as containing, it's a short article, it's got the statistics to which he frequently referred in his talks. Bruce was ill last week, so we sort of punted last week, and was already scheduled at another church today. So this is why I'm here again today. I was here last week because during the service last week, they tapped me on the shoulder and asked me if I could cover for Bruce because he was too ill to come.
You said a quick prayer, and there you go.
Yeah, I guess it's your misfortune that I hit the early service last week. One of the things that I did discuss with Bruce before we started on the substance today is having him come back to give us, how this whole thing turns out. It's unlikely he could do that given the schedule here and the schedule he has on a Sunday, at this hour. But if there's enough people that are interested in finding some other, I don't know, Saturday morning or something like that time, I mean, if you think you might actually attend something like that, could I just see a quick show of hands? And if so, okay, that's certainly enough to try to get it done. So I'll see what we can work out, and he can finish up telling his story. So the subject of this whole series has been secularization, rethinking secularization. And as Bruce said, rethinking suggests that we thought we had it figured out, and now we have to go back and take another look at it. And that's what he has largely been devoting his talks to, was this second look. We usually start these things with a quick recap, and this morning's is going to be very quick for anybody who maybe hasn't had any of the others. What Bruce was describing was what has happened to what's called secularization theory, which has been around for some time, but wasn't always formally labeled secularization theory. That began to happen, I believe, late 19th, early 20th century. People began talking about the tendency of modernization to lead to any number of things, but one of those things was a decline in religiosity. Weber, who wrote in the 19th century mostly, wrote extensively about this. Weber, is anybody who has known Bruce for more than an hour or two will know, is one of his favorite philosophers and sociologists. And Weber was very influential in this whole secularization theory. He used the phrase, it's a phrase I like, a disenchanted world. Modernization, industrialization, the scientific revolution, so brings us into a disenchanted world. We don't need to look for mysterious explanations for things anymore, spiritual or otherwise, because we know what actually causes things. Now, that's a well-known thesis. Lots of people have made things along those lines, some of them very, very tendentiously, people like Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins. I read it, I just happened to, my son subscribes to he had a subscription to National Geographic, which comes on the house, and then I save it for when he's home, which he happens to be this weekend. But, so I was looking at an article on black holes, and I can tell you that there are still plenty of mysteries out there. I mean, black holes are so weird that even physicists who have come up with the equations that more or less convince us that black holes must exist think there's got to be something wrong with the equations, because it just doesn't. I mean, it's all of modern physics is pretty much counterintuitive. You can kind of get the apple falling on Newton's head when it gets to gravity. Quantum mechanics is a good deal harder to come up with little models involving styrofoam balls and wire, and it just gets weirder from there. The whole cosmological thing and whatnot. So I think we still have plenty of mysteries, but what we have now is a situation where we think that these are mysteries that eventually we can figure out some way to solve. We just have to have a mathematical breakthrough or something. That's very different from the way the world was a few hundred years ago. And many people argue that that mystery gave rise to the whole way of religious thinking, and now that the mystery is peeling away, we don't need religious thinking anymore. And that was part of the secularization, big part of the secularization theory. Modernization also leads to urbanization, and urbanization everywhere, and through long periods of history, has generally been marked by declines in the religious practices of the people who come to the cities, as opposed to the people who stay out in the countryside. So that was the theory. Modernization gets us through religion, leads to something else, and for a lot of the secularization theorists, that's a good thing, because religion equals superstition. Bruce's argument in part was that that doesn't really seem to be what's happening exactly. For one thing, the United States is by many measures the most modern country in the world, as he said many times, and while we are less religious than we were a generation or two ago, we are certainly not non-religious, and it doesn't appear that this country is drifting rapidly or otherwise strongly in the direction of secularization. More than half of Americans say that they pray every day. That's not what a statistic you're going to get in a society that's headed towards secularization, widespread secularization. And in the rest of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, there have been religious revivals of various kinds. Christianity is growing very rapidly in China. Islam, of course, is growing rapidly in many parts of the world. In Africa, the growth of Christianity and the growth of Islam are colliding in often violent ways. Western Europe, of course, which is where we all think of as Western Europe is the root of most American religions, most American Christian religions. And Western Europe is clearly very, very much a model of the secularization theory. Since most of the people who espouse this theory are white Europeans or white Americans of European background, there's been a tendency to think that, that this is the trend. In fact, Europe may be the outlier, because the rest of the world isn't looking like Europe. So it's worth keeping in mind that Europe may, in fact, be the one that's different. Because the rest of the world is rapidly modernizing, to various degrees, granted, but still. And yet doesn't seem to be turning in droves away from religion. Okay, so I'll refer briefly to this article once or twice. The thing that was passed out this morning was a book review that was in the Washington Post this past week. And I have my issues with both the review and with the book, but it's worth reading anyway. For another example, here he goes even further. This is Peter Watson, author of the book. He doesn't talk about the age of secularization. He talks about the age of atheism. Those two are not quite the same thing, although fairly clearly linked in a lot of people's minds. Okay, so what we sort of want to talk about today is exactly what do we see happening, and is this picture of the drift towards secularization maybe needs some adjustment. We discussed this before. I think Bruce brought it up in his third session we talked about last week. One of the things that modernization brings is variety. I mean, in everything. If you lived 400 or 500 years ago, with very rare exceptions, you knew exactly what you were going to have for dinner pretty much every day of the week, depending on the season. I mean, there was a time when seasonal vegetables and fruits really meant something. You know, when certain things are in season, they're in season for a short time, and they come into season abundantly, and you eat them, and you pickle them, and you dry them, or whatever, and then they're gone, and you don't see them again until the next season. I mean, even when I was a kid, that was largely the case with things like strawberries, unless you were willing to pay large sums of money for strawberries flown in from somewhere, which we do not. There's a hunting season, and after that, it's done. Up until the early 20th century, in much of the American South, one of the rituals in the fall was the slaughter of a pig or two, and that was your meat for the winter. You might now and then also slaughter a chicken or something, but generally speaking, you were going to be eating various forms of pork for a long time. That, of course, changed as we got more modern. Trade made that change. Even in the 60s and 70s, most people who lived in Beijing, China, had never even seen a banana. Had no idea how to eat one. And there's a rather humorous story about some Red Guards from the South. Remember the Cultural Revolution, these teenage Red Guards traveling all over, it's called revolutionary tourism. And they were in Beijing for some mass meeting. Now, the Beijing people are like New Yorkers or Parisians, you know, they more or less consider themselves the center of their society, and they were making that fairly clear to these sort of southern yokels, as they saw it, who were up there. So these guys from Guangdong had brought with them some bananas. And the Beijing Red Guard were quite curious about these bananas, so they said, yeah, sure, have some. Well, they didn't know to peel them. So, well, I mean, you laugh, but if you've never seen one before, they did not know to peel them. So they tried to eat the thing without peeling, to the considerable delight of their revolutionary brethren from the South. Now, that's an amusing story, but I mention it because for those of you who don't know, China is sort of my main specialty. And I have seen modernization happen in the space of 30 years. It usually takes longer than that. China was an astonishing change. Because when I was first in China, believe me, it was not only a third world country, it was a third world country near the bottom of third world countries. And as we all know, that has changed dramatically in the course of one generation. And when I was traveling around China in the late 70s, if you wanted coffee, you carried instant coffee with you, and you found boiling, because there was boiling water for tea, and you made your own coffee. Things like cheese were virtually unavailable outside one or two cities. The Chinese generally don't like cheese; they think of it as rotten milk. But that, of course, is completely different now, and that has happened in a generation. And that's had all kinds of all kinds of upheavals in China of various kinds. But interestingly, one of those upheavals is that there are more people now interested in investigating religion. Because they can, in part. You can do that within certain limits without getting yourself in very serious trouble. Government still cracks down on religion, but believe me, nothing like the way they did in the 50s or 60s. And people are beginning to investigate that. So they have a variety of choices. In this country and in Western Europe, part of the variety is there's just a lot more to do on Sunday. If you want to see your neighbors and all the rest of that, you don't really need to go to church. I mean, when you were living out in the prairies of North Dakota, a book I read in high school, some stuff that you read in high school does stay with you. And this one is called Giants in the Earth, and it is about the Scandinavian settlers of North Dakota, which was, believe me, a tough gig. And they would go to church if only to see another human being. You know, there was an important role there that had nothing to do with the worship of God. They were also pretty religious, that group, but now there's a lot more to do, as we all know. I mean, everybody who's here has made a choice among at least a half a dozen things, you know, starting with sleeping in. So in that kind of a situation, the need for religion, the place of religion in everyday life, you know, may be diminished by people who choose to make other choices. One argument is that this variety leads to greater individualism. In traditional societies, there is more tendency for people to do kind of the same things at the same time. Again, that's partly because there isn't the range of choice, and it's also partly because the outside pressure, the peer pressure, if you will, in traditional societies, tends to be pretty strong. And whenever you upend that, there's going to be some dislocation. People are going to, kick back against it. That always happens, but still, that trend seems to be a pretty clear trend. And there's lots of examples of that. I mean, this is part of what's behind the whole militant Islam, the revival of very fundamentalist Islam, and so on. A lot of what the Islamic militants protest against in the non-political realm, the social changes, are the changes that come with modernization. I mean, women's rights in medieval Europe were not really on the front burner of anybody's agenda. And we have seen in our own, all of us in our own lifetimes have seen fairly pitched battles fought over that issue, for example. And why? Well, because it's underpinning what people thought of as critical to society. I mean, women do this and men do that, and that's the way it's got to be, or otherwise the whole thing is going to fall apart. And the people who argue that way, frankly, see a lot of evidence that they were right. in modern America, and I think to some extent in Western Europe as well. So, against that, I want to mention a book. Darren brought this up to me when I did a little research. There's a book that was published in 2000 by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. Some of you may remember this book. It was made a big. Robert Putnam is a anthropologist at or sociologist. I forgot.
Political science.
Political science. Thank you. At Harvard, and
What's the name of it?
Bowling Alone.
Bowling?
Bowling, like bowling.
Bowling.
And he has done a lot of interesting work. I mean, Bowling Alone is a shorthand title for, he did a lot of work on social associations in America and how they had changed. And one of his little factoids is that more people bowl now than did in 1960, but fewer of them bowl in leagues than they did in 1960. And that's a shorthand for him for the way all kinds of social connections in America are breaking down. He talks about three kinds of, well, three sort of levels of association. But he gives some examples of things like unions, fraternal associations, you know, the Elks, Rotary, things like that, the PTA. All of these civic or, you know, non-governmental associations, all of these are declining. I mean, there are still parent-teacher associations, although in most of the schools in Virginia, they are now called Parent-Teacher-Student Associations, PTSA. And I was curious about that, so I asked why. Well, PTA that's a trademarked name by the National Parent-Teachers Association. And more schools don't want to be part of that group. They just want something at their school, and therefore they use that PTSA. And maybe in other places they use other terms, and each of them is individual to the school. They are not linked with each other. And that is a profound difference if you think about it. I mean, that really is a profound difference. And I can tell you, and people in here who are parents, I'd be curious to know, throughout my two children, and both of them are now out of high school. So I had, you know, X number of years of dealing with the public school system, and I don't believe I ever attended a single one of the meetings of this group. The only time I'd ever hear from them would be back to school night when they got, you know, 10 minutes to make their pitch. And I paid dues to them because they do certain things, but other than that, I had nothing whatsoever to do with it, which was certainly not the case when I was a kid in school. My mother, occasionally my father, went to those meetings, and things were discussed. So that just doesn't happen anymore. The PTSA at McLean High School, for example, appears to me to be functionally about 5 people who get themselves elected, get the treasurer, and they do some good things. I mean, they do a lot of work, but it's a little committee of people who are interested in doing that for that school and their children. And it isn't, in any sense, the sort of broad civic association with broader goals that would be an example of what Putnam would have been talking about. That's, I think, an interesting, significant, yeah.
It just makes me think about more venues of communication, more different ways of getting the word out. Maybe people don't have to go to PTA meetings.
Well, that is certainly part of it. But it's a different thing. When you're focused, 5 people running the situation on one school instead of part of the national association, that's a different animal. And that's certainly part of the whole thing. And this began, by the way, when Putnam began looking at this issue, was the internet existed, but it had not by any means come to dominate. I mean, and now he also talks about unions, fraternal associations, the PTA. Again, you don't need to go down, you know, to the Loyal Order of Moose Fraternal Hall now to see your buddies. You can get online and chat back and forth, but it's different. It is a different thing when you do that. You're alone, or maybe one or two, but you know, and you're talking to people, but you're not it's not face to face, so it is different. And Putnam is by no means the only person who has made that. I'll say it again.
And this isn't a critique of the analysis, but I think there's another outlier out there, both on secularization and social connectedness, and that's the black church.
Yes,
which
right,
is
that actually is-
absolutely thriving.
That's a
in
point
the
coming
city.
up, if I may, Jack.
Oh, yeah, that's sure. We work well together. You can pay me after the election.
I will do that, yes. Putnam's work was criticized fairly extensively by people in the field. I mean, not just sort of random people who didn't like the message. One of the criticisms is that there has been, do people know what Dunbar's number is? There's a guy named Robin Dunbar, and he did some work. He's a British, now he is an anthropologist, and his argument was that people can maintain actual connections with about 150 other people. And then there'll be some peripheral things, friends from high school that you might be, interested to see again if it was easy to do. It's becoming easier with Facebook and other social media. But, Dunbar links this to basically the size of the neocortex. That's about how many relationships you can keep straight and hierarchically organized and so on. It varies a little bit, 130 to 300. There are people who famously, George Bush the first, with his Rolodex, but he worked at it to keep all those things going. So that was one criticism, is that, along with that criticism of Dunbar's number, is that the point that I think you made is that people have found other ways to have these associations. And yes, they are different, but they're not non-existent. People still have associations. What Putnam calls tertiary organizations have actually grown. A tertiary organization is essentially one where you are a member, you believe in the goals, you write a check, you might stick a bumper sticker with it, but that's the extent of most people's involvement with a group like that. There's a lot of examples. Sierra Club is one. National Organization for Women would be another. Often organized around an issue. I mean, usually I think organized around an issue or something similar. But those have grown quite a bit. And that may, to some extent, satisfy people's needs to feel involved with their community. It is a different kind of involvement, certainly. We collect food here for the food bank. And people go to the grocery store and they shop and they pick up cereal or oil or whatever, and they bring it here and they donate it. And that's critical to the food bank. I'm not knocking that. But most of the people I know who are professionals that way, what they'd actually just as soon get is money. And then they can provide what they need. But that doesn't give you quite the same sense of involvement as picking out the things you're going to donate yourself. And that's a well-known thing within the whole charitable world. So it provides a kind of a sense of participation. And in an interview I read of Putnam, he made, I thought, a very interesting point. Other people criticized his methodology or statistics and so on, but I think those, frankly, a lot of those were quibbles. It seems to me that fundamentally his book was pretty well researched. The interpretation might be open, but he makes an excellent point, and it's a point that Bruce actually hasn't, I think, mentioned, and that is that the fundamental social unit in virtually every society ever studied is what? The family. And the family, traditionally understood in this country and in Western Europe, certainly, is under assault. I mean, and that's a subject for a whole different set of classes, but all of us know, at least vaguely, and Jack at least probably knows exactly, the percentage of unwed mothers who are having children in their teens and things like this, and it's off the charts compared to what it was a few years ago. So there are families of a sort out there, but the traditional family as a kind of cohesive building block for social associations is in decline, or at least it's undergoing change. Decline has a certain value judgment to it, so it's certainly undergoing changes. I don't know how many of you have seen a sitcom that my kids watch, and I became familiar with it. It's called Modern Family, and Modern Family is, there's three different, all related families. One is a wealthy older he's the sort of paterfamilias, with a young, sexy wife and her child. So he's married her second marriage. Then his daughter is a more traditional marriage to a guy, and they have, 3 kids, I think, 2, 3. So the basic mother, father, kids, married, family unit that we think of. The third family is a gay couple that's adopted a kid. So, the modern family, there's an obvious, slightly sarcastic tinge to the title. So what does this have to do with religion? Well, one of the things that it has to do with religion is an awful lot of people join churches when they form families. And since families are being formed differently and later today, people aren't joining churches at the same rate. Often now, by the time people become members of a church, or become part of a family, they have been out of the church long enough that they don't really feel any kind of a call to go back to it. One of the problems we've had in this church that we deal with is we have a lot of people who seem to, I don't know a lot, I don't really know numbers, but certainly there is at best, significant minority of the children in our Sunday schools whose parents are virtually disconnected from the church. They drop the kids off and they pick them up. And often they're not on the property, which is a legal problem among other things. We are not licensed as a child care facility, but the kids are there to learn a little bit about Western, basic Western culture and some good, solid ethical training. And that's why they're there in Sunday school, And that's a little different from what we would like to think of the mission of our Christian education as being. So there's an example of that. They feel that somehow the kids ought to know something about the church, but they're not committed to it in any way at all. And we're not unique in that by any means. Now, there are some significant exceptions to this in the U.S., as you mentioned, the black church. The black church remains the critically important unit for the black community in America, but particularly, I would say, and I haven't seen studies on this is just kind of anecdotal, it is particularly the case for the black community that still lives in majority black areas. In other words, it's a neighborhood church kind of a thing. I would be curious to know, among middle-class blacks who live more dispersed, whether the church continues to play that important a role. That would address the whole modernization argument, secularization.
At least in D.C., there's a real phenomenon of suburban black churches with members who still belong downtown.
Right. Yes.
And the attendant parking problems and
Yeah.
everything else.
And that would argue that is still happening. Let's give it a generation, because those suburban blacks, they are definitely first generation, almost all.
Yeah.
Because we all remember that even my next door neighbors are black and successful lawyers and all the rest of that, and they did not experience outright discrimination when they were shopping for their houses, but they did find that they were often asked, "Well, can you afford this?" Those kinds of questions. And steered until Judy more or less said, "We want a house in this neighborhood, in this school district, and we better see some because there are some for sale here." She sort of had to have that talk with her real estate agent to get the message across that they weren't looking to buy in Prince George's County. So it's still out there, but 10 or 12 or 20 years before that, she simply would have been shown houses in an area like McLean. It just wouldn't have happened. They bought their house in the middle 80s. Bruce has referred to the nuns. I'm kind of jumping right into it. The secularization. The nuns are those people who, when asked what their religious affiliation is, say none. When an allied phenomenon is the SBNR, the spiritual but not religious. Now, the secularization theorists like to see that as example that they were right, that people are saying that they don't have a religious affiliation. The thing about that argument, I think, and Bruce made this point, I think makes it more strongly. That's an argument about saying, are you affiliated with organized religion? That's not an argument about saying, are you religious? Yes, they will say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. If you dig a little bit on that, you find that what they mean by religious, and lots of articles on this subject, often equates to the religion that they see discussed in the public sphere, which is always against something. It is against gay marriage. It is against, the whole gay rights movement. It tends to be, not so long ago, it was against the broadening of roles of women. Many of these denominations of this particular type will not ordain women and think it's wrong to ordain women. They're against this, they're against that. And what are they for? Well, they're not for anything that gets people, particularly younger people, very fired up. One of the huge social shifts, as we all know, has been in the attitudes towards homosexuality. Now, that is still very controversial. There are still ballot measures on both sides. People still very strongly, I'm sure in this church, people feel very strongly about the issue in different ways. But among younger generation, my son is 19 years old, it's virtually a non-issue. He almost can't understand why it's a big deal for people. I mean, that's, if you were to have been a supporter of gay rights when I was 19, you might have been able to make your arguments, but you would definitely have been a committed advocate for that, and outside the mainstream of thinking. Now, that, it's most of my son's friends are like, they might joke about it now and then, oh, that's so gay, that kind of thing. But, they don't mean much about it, really. That's a huge social shift. And that's a social shift that religion, capital R, as many of the younger folks see it, has been against. So that's part of the problem with this spiritual but not religious thing. The argument is that people do, in fact, there seem to be, if you ask questions differently, an awful lot of people do, younger people, seem to be looking for something to fill up the middle of their lives. And this is true also, by the way, in Western Europe. There you get a little bit different kind of twist to it. But this comes back to, let me read here from Watson's, this is for that review of the Age of Atheism. Now, one of the points he makes about this book is that this is a book that talks about the age of atheism, but not in a way that excoriates religion, that's shrill and a violent attack on religion. More simply examining what in fact is happening and the reasons, and how it's happening. Philosopher Charles Taylor, paraphrased by Watson, says, people who live a holy secular life are missing out. They lack, and here's the quote, a sense of wholeness, fulfillment, fullness of meaning, a sense of something higher. They have an incompleteness, a massive blindness to the fact that there is some purpose in life beyond the utilitarian. You remember that Bruce said, secularization, secular essentially equates to worldliness. And one of the criticisms of secularization, or one of the problems it has encountered, is that once you remove the otherworldly, if you want to put it that way, you're kind of left with concentration on the mundane. That's kind of it, right? So you're sort of centering your life on the mundane things of life. Well, that isn't enough for people. Now, Watson argues that atheists have recognized this, and there are atheist thinkers who are looking for... one example of those that we all read in high school or college were the existentialist philosophers. That being is, the fact that we are alive is, that's the meaning right there. You create your own meaning through how you live your life and so on. But existentialism is a fairly cold and chilly philosophy, and it's not everybody gets assigned to read The Exit, or No Exit, or The Stranger in high school these days. But it's, other than that, existentialism is not by any means a very popular intellectual movement anymore. It simply wasn't fulfilling enough. Well, maybe, so Watson's book concentrates on those brave souls, again quoting, who instead of waiting and wallowing in the cold, dark wastelands of a godless world, have devoted their creative energies to devising ways to live on with self-reliance, invention, hope, wit, and enthusiasm. Okay, so what he's talking about, again quoting, in this case, the reviewer, Michael Durda, they're looking for ways by which we might re-enchant our lives in the here and now. Now, this is, the assumption here is that religion isn't going to do it, so we need to find something else. They may be wrong about that. One of the points about this whole thing is that these things do in fact tend to be cyclical. We're already seeing the signs that in some way or another this yearning, religious yearning, however you will, hasn't gone away. It's out there still. So maybe to say that the nuns equal secularization is considerably too much of an oversimplification. What most of the nuns may in fact be saying is not that they are looking for some meaning in their life that might involve religion, small r. They simply do not find organized religion as it has presented itself to them to be very compelling. That's a very different thing. And in fact, it's a little bit along the lines of, Martin Luther John Calvin and others found organized religion as it presented itself to them not very fulfilling, and they went and did something about it. And there could be something like that. We're not predicting that, but at least it's a possibility, and there's some signs of it. The second problem with the secularization theory, as Jack mentioned, is that it's a white middle class phenomenon, largely, in this country and elsewhere. I don't know. I think there is some uniformity among non-Hispanic whites in this country, whether you're at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale or the higher end, in turning away from organized religion. But it is certainly more pronounced among those people who have persuaded themselves, perhaps subconsciously, that because of their own attainments, they don't need religion anymore. That's not a conscious process. Most people don't sit down and think, you know, hey, I got my degree from Harvard, and I certainly don't need God anymore. But the more successful you are, the more often you are too inclined to think it was all your own doing that made you successful. That's a fairly well-established psychological happenstance. It is why people who live, you know, at this a little bit more day-to-day are more likely to stop and help a broken down motorist by the side of the road than somebody, you know, who's rushing from meeting to meeting. I mean, that's many studies have shown that it is the poor people who are more likely to stop and offer help to a stranger than the better off.
And give a larger percentage of their income.
And give a larger percentage of their income, yeah. So, but this is a white middle class phenomenon, and the white middle class, of course, is strongest in Western Europe and less pronounced in the United States. The black church, the Hispanic church are both flourishing in this country, both potent forces in their communities. Christianity is growing in Asia, but it's not the only thing growing in Asia. And there's a dark side to this, too. You find a resurgence of Buddhist identity in Southeast Asia has led to violence between Buddhists and Muslims, for example. So some of this is, I mean, it's a complicated, the bottom line is, this is a pretty complicated picture. And you really can't argue, as the secularization theorists, remember that Bruce's real focus on this class is secularization theory. It becomes increasingly difficult to argue that it's a simple picture, that modernization equals secularization, because it just isn't happening that way in some other parts of the world as they modernize. One of the things that has always been the case in the United States is that religious views were very diverse, compared even with Western Europe. We had, it was largely Christian, but there were more varieties of Christianity here than you would generally find, and the historical reasons are obvious for this, than you would generally find in any given country in Europe. Yes, there were all these, most of these religions, not all, but most originated in Europe, but they found their different expressions here, and of course they spread all over the place. There are more, I mean, by probably 1880 or so, there were more German pietists in this country than there were in Germany, where they came from. That's the Pennsylvania Dutch, you know, the Amish, the Mennonites, and so on. As probably most of you know, that Dutch is a corruption of Deutsch, German. Baptists, the Baptists, that's a very broad category, it really kind of began in the British Isles, but didn't flourish there, but flourished here hugely. Mormonism, of course, started here. Christian Science, I think, here also. And part of this is the state church argument. We've talked about this before. We've never had an established church in the United States. It's been much more of a marketplace kind of thing. And so, you know, if you had some new idea, you could start it up and see how it went and all the rest of that. And that was less true in most Western European countries. I mean, Britain had various periods when there was a lot of diversity in British Christianity. Particularly in the south and southeast of England for a while, there were all sorts of sects beginning that claimed themselves as Christian. And most of them have died out now, but I mean, it did exist. Nonetheless, there always was an established church. And certain things, there were certain things, the church had an established legal civil role that you had to, you might want to get married in your church and all that, but you also had to have that marriage recognized by the parish in which you lived and recorded. You know, things like that. boon to historians because the parish records were very complete and all the rest of that. But that marketplace never existed in anything like it did here. So we have always been fairly diverse in terms of the religious spectrum. And as the world has modernized, if you will, another corollary of modernization has, of course, been globalization. And we think of globalization as a new thing, but it's not a new thing. Globalization really began with the age of exploration. Europeans busting out, going all over the place. And there have been sort of mini globalizations often in history. Genghis Khan, for example, the largest contiguous land empire in history, from Budapest to the Pacific Ocean and down through Southeast Asia. And when Genghis Khan and his successors established the Mongol Empire, inside that empire, trade flourished, and people began to see things they'd never seen before. When the Spanish came to the New World, I mean, when you think of Italian cuisine, what's the first vegetable that comes to everybody's mind? And that vegetable is the tomato, sure, and that came from, the New World. When the Irish, you think of Irish cuisine, yeah, and that led, of course, to all the Irish potatoes were descended from 6 potatoes that were brought to that, which is why when that's why when the potato blight hit, it wiped out, because there was no genetic diversity. It hit all of the crop. But it's an example of those, so that globalization thing, a lot of the Midwest was able finally to be settled by farmers because of strains of wheat brought from the Ukraine by Ukrainian German farmers in the 19th century, which could survive the winters there, whereas the British strains could not. So that is why until the mid-19th century, you didn't have much in the way of people crossed it to get to the West Coast where they could establish farms. The only people you found in the Midwest were the cattle farmers, because cattle could, to some extent, live on the native grasses and so on there. And then you began to get the farmers coming in when you had other crops. In the north, also rye and barley from the Scandinavians, where wheat was never a principal crop because the growing season was too short. So globalization is not new. The pace of it is certainly picked up. Armenians can tell you about globalization. One of the things Europeans brought with them was smallpox, measles, things like that. And we all know that led to, no one knows for sure, but maybe the death of 90% of the population of Native Americans who were here when the Europeans arrived, because they had zero resistance to those diseases. So the globalization thing but it is accelerating. It takes you a few hours now instead of a few months to get to London. And what that means now in this country, you drive around here, and you can find Jewish temples and synagogues, which did exist in colonial America. There weren't many, but there were some. There were Muslims in colonial America too. There were, again, not many, but there were some. And among others, Thomas Jefferson wrote approvingly of certain aspects of the Islamic religion as he understood it. And now we have many Muslims. We have large Buddhist populations in this country. And other religions. Hindus, and certainly one of my colleagues at work is a Hindu. I doubt if there were 5 Hindus working for the agency even when I started there in the 80s. So I could be wrong about that, but certainly not many. And now it's pretty common. So there's all sorts of that kind of diversity here. Yes, maybe that is more an argument that the secularization theorists need to address. They kind of haven't addressed it, so as I understand it. I'm not an expert in this area like Bruce is, but maybe the real issue here is not that religion is going away, but that religion as we would like to understand it is going away. And that has a different set of implications for a church like Williamsville. Let's see, I wanted to read one other quote here. This is again from this essay, this book review. People yearn for connection with others, for what Nietzsche called self-realization within the community. And the argument of the book review is that that's in fact what the new atheists are trying to create. So another thing I'd like to see secularization theory address, if they can do so a little bit objectively, is can you in fact, is that successful? Again, not the first time it's been tried. The Stoics essentially tried that approach through philosophy. And there are many admirers of the Stoics today, but you don't find many people getting together to discuss Stoic philosophy and how it impacts their daily life, which, we still do in this church and other churches. So I think the question there is, and I think it is an open question, but is it actually possible to recreate the religious experience, if you will, without religion? I think that's really the question, secularization. So I'd like to just end there, and then questions, discussion, comments, where do you think we might go? What does any of this have to do with Lutheran? I guess one question.
The mega church phenomenon, which is primarily middle class, upper middle class, that is happening throughout the U.S., how does that fit in as a part of the similar phenomenon as the black congregations? But
I would say two things. And the first, maybe people can correct me, but my understanding is that the megachurch wave has crested and is now beginning to recede a little. The fellow who started Willow Creek, what's his name?
I think it's Hibbles.
Hibbles? Has, in fact, said that he does not think that this is a viable long-term thing anymore. He's turned away from it a little bit. But even at its height, I remember seeing on that CBS series about religion in America, Willow Creek, and they made no bones about this, Willow Creek's Sunday morning services were entertainment. They were a spectacle. People would show up, and they had sound and light shows and all kinds of highly trained readers and all the rest of that kind of thing. People would sit there and take little part in it. It had nothing like the liturgy that we participate in here. Now, I come out of a liturgical tradition, and I tend to support that. But I think people need to understand that one of the purposes of that liturgy, confession of sins and prayers of certain kinds in certain parts of the service and so on, is in fact that you are connecting yourself with the way it has been done since about 400 AD, in some form or another. And that, I think, is important. But a lot of people, that doesn't get emphasized much when we do the liturgy. We just do it. There's in the bulletin, we'll do that. But that's part of the reason for it. There are other reasons for it. There is a whole progression of liturgy. The megachurches tend not to do liturgy. And they're not the only ones. I mean, Southern Baptists don't do it, and part of the reason is that I think it's important is that is part of where you participate in the worship service. In these megachurches, what they tend to do is sing and say amen at the end of the prayers, and that's kind of it. But Willow Creek, if you wanted to become a member of Willow Creek, it was a requirement that you join one of their small group ministries. In effect, a sort of Christ Care organization. That was a requirement because Hibbles and other pastors of that church, they had about 10, I think, were well aware that sitting there in the pew on Sunday morning being entertained, the purpose of that, in their view, was to get you in there. But in order to become a member of the church, and I think Hibbles was sincerely, Christian in his. There are charlatans out there. I don't think he was one at all, and he recognized that people really need to have a smaller group that they can connect with, and that group on Sunday morning was not going to be it. So we'll see.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that point. I read a study somewhere about this that had to do with intimacy, and that one reason for the possible decline. And there was a plumber in our yard, just getting out of his truck. He had a huge pectoral cross, and I asked him about his church, and he said, well, we were a member of the Catholic Church, but it was huge. We didn't know anybody, so he's now part of a smaller church. But his whole framing was intimacy. And he said, in my church, they know me. And he said, I was in a 2,000 person church. He said, nobody knew me.
When I was growing up in the Lutheran church, it was a general practice in our part of the country that once a church hit about 500 members, and of course I grew up, through that period of time in American history when churches were growing, the tendency was to look to establish another church somewhere, because the general feeling was that, now the model for most of the Lutheran churches in my area was one pastor, maybe an associate pastor, but mostly not. The idea was you had one pastor with a couple of I mean, very different, many more volunteers, very different society.
Yeah.
But my church, the pastor was paid, his secretary was paid, and there was a part-time janitor, and that was the paid staff of the church. Everybody else, the whole Sunday school program was run by volunteers, the music program was run by volunteers, professional musicians in some cases, but volunteers. So it was very different. But the idea that there was an actual distrust of churches that got too big, I think partly for that reason. You get 1,000 people in a church and you can't know them. So I think that's a good point, and that comes back to the community point. I mean, maybe one of the things that organized religion has failed to provide is a genuine sense of community. And that's particularly, I think, an issue. Mainline Protestant churches are the ones in the most precipitous decline, and we all know that. And I think there's a lot of reasons for it. But part of the reason for, variety of reasons for it, it'd be interesting to, again, we've had classes on that too. How does that tie in with this? Is that part of the same phenomenon? I mean, I guess it has to be to some extent. But an awful lot of the groups that we've talked about that are most likely to say spiritual but not religious, they're white middle class. That's the base of most of the, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians. I mean, that's the white middle class religion. Yeah, okay, there's some white middle class Catholics. They're different, but that's so. These are, I think, linked phenomena. It's an interesting thing to me. Neither one of my kids, and again, this was pretty common for, I think, most college kids. Neither one of my kids regularly attended any sort of church service when they were away at college. Well, my son's only been away for part of the year. And he was feeling rather disconnected when he went up to, kill me if you get ours. But when he was first up there at Syracuse, he had made a circle of friends. All of his friends were at Virginia schools. He was wondering if he made the wrong choice. And last night he was wondering again if he made the wrong choice. For those of you who don't follow college basketball, Virginia cleaned Syracuse last night, which was not expected by, I think, anybody. But it was all because of and I said, we had met the chaplain for, she's actually a Methodist, but she covers the Presbyterians too. We met her when we were up there for the, orientation thing. I said, go by the chapel. They've got all these things going. There's a group there, go. And he never did do it. My daughter certainly didn't. And my daughter was a lot more church-oriented growing up than my son. She didn't go to services up there, but when they come home, particularly Lee, they still want, this is the church that they identify with. So there's some sense of community. Now, obviously family's part of that too. But it's finding a way to transfer that community identification when they move away from home, I think that has been part of the problem. And of course, again, this is increasingly a problem of modernization, because although Americans have always moved around, they didn't move around as much 3 or 4 generations ago as they do now. And when they did move, they were likely to be moving in, if they moved any distance away. It's one thing to move from New Jersey to Delaware, but if you move from New Jersey to California, you probably aren't going to see your family again very often. You want something that is familiar, and so you often find that in a church like the one that you grew up in. I think that's less the case now. Again, coming back to, now you can Skype, you can Facebook, you can pick up your cell phone and call, and there isn't as much reason to do it. Anything else people want to?
One of the things that you didn't mention was that in this increased variety that we have within our society, although we will celebrate that, we celebrate the fact that, yes, I know a Buddhist and I know a Hindu, and we have people from all different countries living in our, we still have, there still is that desire to associate with people who you feel have some common ties. And so even within a specific religious organization, you will find one church that tends to attract more Hispanics, one church that attracts more Japanese. This is part of the problem with the large mega churches, is that as long as everybody still felt that they were on the same kind of community, that it worked. But when you had a variety of people joining, then they still wanted to form different groups.
I've never seen formal studies on this, but I have thought for a long time that one of the factors influencing the decline of mainline Protestantism is the weakening of the European-based ethnic identities. When I was a kid, people were much more aware of, it seems to me, that the kid, high school kids, for example, were more aware of whether their family's background was Scandinavian, German, British Isles, that sort of thing. And of course, the churches are organized kind of that way. Lutheran churches were German and Scandinavian. Most of the rest had their origins in various parts of the British Isles. Scots tended to be Presbyterian and so on. And I don't think it's the whole story, but I certainly think there's some of that. My Lutheran church gave services in 3 languages: English, Swedish, and Latvian.
Just one other point that may be a little bit in the ozone, but I'm struck by the fact that our leaders, Obama, George Bush, are unafraid to use religious language. And in federal government, in each of the federal agencies, there is a faith-based liaison. I work very closely with Eugene Schneeberg in the Justice Department, who is responsible for mobilizing churches around the crime and violence issue. He's got a counterpart in labor. So there is a certain still, I think, lack of, and George Bush saying Jesus Christ was his favorite philosopher, or most important. So it interests me that, I don't know whether it can be elevated to counter trend, but there's less timidity, which shocks my European friends, about our leaders.
Well, you have less timidity. You might even go further. I mean, significant political leaders in the United States are virtually compelled to use religious language. Or they would be attacked for not doing it.
Well, that's the other side.
Which does not mean their use of it is not sincere, but we do operate differently. Now, you see it in some European politicians, in Catholic countries, for example, and now and then. I mean, not consistently, not like here by any means. But you do see it. But I think that's true. I think that the fact that they're compelled to do it is partly just political cynicism, but it's also partly the fact that I think in this country we still think that this is an important part of a person's being, and we want to have some evidence that.
This is in another part of the ozone. Camus, I read this in the Christian Century a few years ago. He made some visits to the American church in Paris and spoke privately to the pastor there. And this article was written by the pastor. And Camus asked if he could be baptized privately. And the pastor said, no, we never do private, we never do private baptism. This is a part of the community. This is a profession of the community. You're coming into the community. And Camus just said, not going there, and never came back.
He had too much at stake for his.
And yes, but
yeah,
that's a part of that.
yeah.
That's spiritual, but not religious,
Yeah.
How do you confront the community in a way?
I should have done this earlier, but I dug up an article, and I didn't Xerox this because I didn't have his permission to do it. This is by Bruce Douglas. He wrote it for another different situation, but it's about this issue. And he says, as much as changing one's allegiance from one religion or denomination to another might seem to be similar to disaffiliation, however, it is not at all the same thing. In fact, it is not inappropriate to think of such behavior as a reflection of a state of mind that is actually just the opposite of the sort that inclines people to refuse to identify with a particular religion. For as dissatisfied as the person who forsakes one religion in favor of another may be, he or she is still looking presumably for a preferable one with which to identify. Such a person still thinks of religion as a communal activity, in other words. Now that applies to people that are looking for other religions. It doesn't apply for people that are just leaving religion, but earlier in the article, he's linked that a little bit with the spiritual but not religious response. That is, that would suggest that these people are still looking for something with which to affiliate themselves. So that, and I will get in touch with Bruce and the powers that be and see what we can do for it. So that's probably going to be like on the website and the bulletins and so on. So we'll do what we can to get some sort of publicity out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.